The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
Criminals will always look to the weakest link. How do I get access to the UK financial system, and what's the easiest way I can do it? And a newly authorised firm can often be seen as a really easy route in. There's a good chance that all your systems and controls are not working as well as you wanted them to. Newly authorised firms and banks in particular, that is often seen as a weak point. And that's, I think, when you often need to be kind of the most vigilant.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world. In the world of financial services, a banking license can seem like the Holy Grail, the key to unlocking powerful capabilities like holding deposits, lending, managing mortgage books, and more. But much like Indiana Jones' quest for the Holy Grail, there are numerous trials and hurdles standing in the way of obtaining it. And once you do, what about the ghouls lurking in the shadows, ready to come for your shiny new license for their own nefarious purposes?
I hate these guys.
I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are asking, how does a banking license impact compliance teams? We'll be discussing what happens during the application process, which tests your compliance teams. Does finally getting the license provide new challenges? And are these licenses so important for protecting the public from financial crime? To dive into this topic, I'm here with Emma Hagan, soon to be UK CEO of Clearbank. Welcome back to The Laundry, Emma. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Can you remind our listeners about you, your background, and Clearbank?
Sure. So I am soon to be UK CEO, but the past 4 years prior to that, I've been the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Clearbank. And in financial services, and having gone through a few license processes in my time. And Clearbank was the first full-service clearing bank in around 250 years when it was licensed back in 2016. And it supplies access payment services and accounts for a range of financial institutions across kind of standard agency clearing through API, cloud-native technology, and also embedded banking, where we partner with EMIs and payment firms to embed banking solutions into end-user experiences.
Thank you for the intro. Let's dive into the conversation. And let's start by looking at the application process itself. So, you've been through it. How would you rate the difficulty of obtaining a banking license?
It is pretty hard, rightly so. And it is often more complex and more time-consuming than you think at the outset. It's definitely worth it in the end, but it does take quite a lot of resilience, ability to overcome challenges, to be able to get there in the end, and a lot of partnership work within both the company if you're working through it as a team, and also partnering with the regulators that you have to convince to give you that banking license.
I understand. So what were some of the most challenging moments for you when you've been in the midst of all of this? Can you give our listeners some highlights and lowlights?
One of the biggest highlights is obviously when you get the license itself, and certainly there's often key milestones along the way when you sort of feels like you pass a phase of the assessment, and that always feels really good. So you move on to the next topic and you know you're pretty much done on that piece of the application. Those are great moments to savor because it can be quite lengthy in terms of that process, as I touched on, and therefore you have to take some of those small wins along the way. I think lowlights, I think when you get stuck on a particularly challenging issue, and there is a piece on the licensing process in particular where one of the aspects that they're trying to assess is, I'll call it the design of what you're trying to do, and kind of making and getting everybody on the same page about what that looks like, particularly if your business model is a bit different and therefore it doesn't fit a standard model, and why the application or how you're looking at the regulations or AML risk kind of fits what you're trying to do, particularly when it's brand new to the market. That is always really tough. And sometimes those conversations can go on for quite a long time as you get to a place where you both can hopefully find a mutually agreeable way forward. And like I say, it's particularly true when what you're trying to do is a little bit different. And I know certainly from a Clearbank perspective, when we started, no one had really done what we had done before, like a cloud-based bank, and also the embedded banking piece of the puzzle. And that is an ongoing dialogue around how the kind of existing regime translates into what you're trying to do, and therefore why what you're proposing is okay and it should be kind of valid in terms of getting that license approval in the end. I think as many startups also know, quite often your plans change along the way, and what you thought was maybe the business model or the service you're offering, they might change as you go through that build process and do some of the market testing. And so it can be a fairly challenging process to keep everybody aligned about what you're trying to do, that it's a viable business model, and how you built the right systems and controls in order to get that golden license at the end.
If you were to put together a checklist or give your top 3 advice to someone who is about to go through this process, what would it be?
First, there's a lot of great materials out there in terms of things that are, I'll call it the checklist part of the documents you need to supply. I think the piece of advice I'd give is, firstly, always look beyond the checklist and try and understand what it is that you're trying to achieve versus, so I just need to supply X document and that will be good enough. It's all got to hang together as one big process and big document. So the things I think I've learned certainly along the way is the importance of a final review by a couple of people who look at everything. So making sure that what you say in your front reg business plan is exactly how your compliance policies stack up in terms of how they map to those different services, how they map to the regulations, that your technology documents that set out your IT architecture and your systems and controls there match up to the other documents. And having kind of an complete owner that looks at the whole thing end to end, I think is really important. I think using the other piece of advice I give is most people quite rightly use advisors to help them get it right. So people who've been through the process before, and it's a really great idea because they'll know the pitfalls that maybe you won't if you're doing it for the first time. I think one of the difficult parts though is when people think that they try and outsource that to a firm, and you really need to take ownership for everything you're putting in that set of documents. And like I say, that they kind of hang together as one complete story. I think quite often, and you see this through some of their feedback, where people just outsource to it and have somebody else produce the document, they then have to operationalise it and prove that they can do all the things they say in that wonderful document in practice. And that's quite often where it comes unstuck in the licensing process.
We are speaking about this topic now partly due to the big news that Revolut obtained their UK banking license 3 years after initially applying.
Interesting to see you applying for this UK banking license. Why do you find the UK banking market so attractive, given how competitive, how much competition there is from both the incumbent high street players and indeed plenty of startups?
Well, UK is our number 1 country. It's a very profitable country for us. And then when we've done the survey and we asked our customers what would make them to put even more money through Revolut platform, it was a banking license and deposit insurance. So that was the reason why we decided to apply for banking license in UK as well.
What can be the factors, like in general, that makes a process take that long to go through?
It can be really varied. Sometimes it's down to a firm's readiness for it. So, for example, I've been in processes before where you're getting ready and everything is stacking up pretty well, but actually, for example, you're not ready on day one. Your technology is taking longer to deliver, and therefore you won't get the license until you kind of got there to that end state and proven that you can effectively open for business on day one. So sometimes it's a lot about the firm and kind of closing out those final gaps. It might be hiring key people. And again, most of those roles will require regulatory approval. And so that can take time, and you don't want to hire too soon in the process and carry all the costs for it. But equally, you've got to get through some of those approval processes to get the license. So that can be why. I think also there can be, particularly if you've got an existing business, it's a pro and a con. If you're brand new, there's no existing things that you have to work through with a regulator, like existing pieces of your business or existing controls in operating effectiveness. And that can be challenging because it's purely on design. But equally, if you've got a business and there are things that aren't working perfectly, you have to work through those too with them. So it's kind of pros and cons if you have existing versus new. But the licensing process is so comprehensive there can be any number of things that mean that something takes a long time. And equally, that might not just be because there's an issue on the regulator's side. It might be something that you have to do yourself, or a readiness internally that you're not quite there with. And so it could be pretty varied as to why that takes so long.
They got their banking license with restrictions. So it's more of a tentative approval, and where they need to build up their banking operations. Do you have any thoughts on what do you need to improve, or what do you need to work on when you get this license with restrictions?
This was a process that was introduced, it was a few years ago, and it was really because one of the challenges for the process before they introduced this mobilization phase was you had to do everything. You had to spend all of the money, raise all of the capital, make all of the investment, and then hope that you got a banking license at the end. And that's a pretty big risk for anybody. And so one of the stages in the process that was introduced was this mobilization phase, which says actually you can get most of the way there, then we'll give you confidence you're going to get a banking license. And that kind of gives you I'll call it the confidence to finish the work. And so it was a really good way of supporting innovation without it being such a big all or nothing risk at the end of it, as whether you were going to make it. And bear in mind, as we touched in the beginning, how difficult it can be to get banking license. And so that mobilization phase is really for testing and practice, finishing the IT work, proving out that all of that design work that you go through in the licensing, that you can actually operate it in practice. I think that's incredibly helpful, particularly for newly licensed firms, to be able to do it in practice. Because otherwise you have this big, it's almost like a cliff edge. You do all this work in design, it looks great, you might get a banking license, and then on day one, you've got to be ready for whatever comes your way in terms of business. I think that mobilization really helps you do proper live kind of testing in a safe environment, while still knowing if you complete that work, you can get the banking license at the end.
And what do you wish that, with your experience and what you've heard from peers and in the industry in general, what are the things that you wish the regulators understood better? So things were perhaps took shorter time or were easier to do. What's like the top things that they kind of not understand properly or miss out on in a process like this?
I think most of it is that the innovation part, it's quite hard because there's so many, the great part is there's so many new business models coming through. The downside of that is somebody has to go first. And that's a really tough ask when you're trying to innovate and go through a licensing process at the same time. And so you're asking somebody, hey, can we innovate and get you comfortable, and you understand this new thing as much as we do? And that's a pretty big ask to do along the way. And I think that's the piece, if you like, that the ability to be innovative whilst making sure that you get the basics right. I think that's probably the hardest part in that process, because often I'll call it the regulatory rules don't exactly translate into what you're trying to do. And that requires quite a lot of communication and a real openness from the regulators to support the innovation, whilst I'll call it creating the confidence so you're not going to mess it up.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with you very shortly. Don't go anywhere. Ownership is important at Strise. Our UBO maps are a signature feature for a reason. That's why it's crucial that our users should be able to amend and edit the ownership structures of a company the minute they get the new information. Strise's latest feature, Edit Ownership, does just that. You can edit ownership information all in a centralized location. Quick and accurate data management is key to making sound business decisions, especially with no loss to your workflow. Goodbye, outdated ownership data. Hello, AML intelligence. Nice! Okay, having gone through the application process and you're now a fully licensed bank, let's look at what it means for a compliance team and their financial services providers. So you got your license, you're a fully licensed bank. What does this mean for the AML and compliance team? Do they suddenly have to scale rapidly? Does the everyday change, or what does it mean in practice?
I think When I've gone through it before, it felt like this big highlight. You get the banking license and it's amazing and you think, fantastic, we're ready to go. And then it's a bit like a baptism of fire because suddenly there's real things coming in. And if you are very successful, then you get this flood of customers and activity. And it's really hard to predict whether or not you've got the right resourcing in place for that and whether or not the controls are robust enough for the pace that you start to grow. And for most people, I think you're trying to be proportionate in the early days. So you've kind of built for a certain level of business on day one. But quite often, if you are successful, it rapidly outpaces that. And I think the really hard part is being super agile in that early phase to understand, okay, something's not working the way I wanted it to, or it's not scaling fast enough, and being able to prioritize then where you start to fix or improve along the way, because you're not going to get it right on day one. I think one of the pitfalls, particularly if you're in a fast growing fintech type banking environment, is you think that what you build on day one is going to see you through for, say, 5 years. The reality is it's probably 12 months at most before you've got to redo it, because you're growing fast and you're being successful. Things are working differently in practice the way you thought they would in theory, and you have to pivot quite quickly. And that might also mean recognizing you haven't quite got the skills, the talent that you thought you were going to need. That some people are great to build projects, some people are great for run. Occasionally you find the wonderful thing where someone's great at both, and you might have to quickly bring in some additional resource or change out some of your team or rebuild your program. And kind of building in the flex to be able to do that pretty quickly, I think is pretty critical to maintaining the confidence that hopefully you built through the licensing process and you don't want to lose when you start business. But it was quite a shock to the system going live on kind of day one. In the first few weeks felt a little bit like you were kind of running around trying to make sure everything was working and nothing was falling over, and a little bit of helping and piling in with first line teams to again, understand how you operationalize some of those processes and procedures and policies.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you think that, big news, there is a new firm that got their banking license. What do you think the criminals talk about then? Is everyone then trying to exploit this, or how? Do you have any thoughts, speculations, or insights into that?
Yeah, I think with the benefit of having, I guess, both being through licensing processes, kind of from being the firm that's gone through it, and also seeing, and the Clearbank again supports lots of FIs who are newly authorized, and maybe not banks, but who are looking to go live and make that transition from pre-authorization into post. I think criminals will always look for the weakest link. How do I get access to the UK financial system, and what's the easiest way I can do it? And a newly authorised firm, and particularly a bank that usually has more access than, say, a kind of a payment firm or an e-money, can often be seen as a really easy route in. When I talked about kind of that feeling of that baptism of fire when you're just starting, going live, and you're getting business coming through, there's a good chance that all your systems and controls are not working as well as you wanted them to, or there's some little gap that you didn't see in practice that somebody's able to exploit. And I think quite often, again, people who are looking to exploit and access the financial system for financial crime, newly authorized firms and banks in particular, that is often seen as a weak point. And that's, I think, when you often need to be kind of the most vigilant, because you're not quite there on the maturity. You can't necessarily completely rely on your systems and controls like you would if you're a mature firm. You often don't have access to some of the networks that will help you identify kind of new and emerging typologies. So you kind of at a little bit of a weak point in your development, and that makes you most vulnerable to criminals.
I guess, mortgages is a product that you can launch when you have your license, and lots of people, you need a place to live, you need to buy your house, your apartment, and so forth. But I'm just wondering what's your thoughts on how mortgages can become a financial crime risk. Is there any data points or any thoughts you'd like to share on that? I'm super curious to hear your take on it.
I think there was, the real estate market itself has been identified in many studies as kind of one of a big entry point, particularly for financial crime, and being really clear about the beneficiaries of mortgage lending that you're doing is pretty critical to ensuring that that isn't a kind of backdoor entry system, if you like, for laundering of criminal proceeds or access for individuals who are subject to sanctions. And particularly, I think in the UK and the London property market in particular is a little bit more vulnerable, perhaps because of the openness of the market, and the UK is a kind of hub for financial markets as a whole. So again, I think if you're entering into that area, you've got to be particularly aware of those risks. And I think this is where hiring the right expertise on day one really pays off, in terms of bringing somebody in who kind of knows how to set up those controls, and where in particular you might be exposed to that. And I think that as part of the banking license process more broadly, kind of finding the right, in the MLRO role on your financial crime teams, people who know the risks for your particular business model is really key, because that can really help you avoid the pitfalls that might exist if you're looking to go into mortgage lending, for example, or if like Clearbank does, you're looking at providing access to other FIs. You really need someone who knows that segment of the market really well to make sure that you are on top of that risk from day one.
Lending as well. What were some of the risk associated with like lending?
So I think again, knowing where the source of the repayment is coming from. So when you're lending to either an individual or a firm, there's obviously the money that you're lending and your KYC or KYB on that individual or the firm itself, but then understanding where the source of repayment and where the ultimate funds, the loan proceeds, are going to. Quite often there could be a bit of a misconception that lending isn't exposed to the same kind of risks as, say, current accounts or operational accounts. And I think that makes it, that kind of misconception, if you like, can make it a particularly weak space if you're not on top of those risks. So really understanding source of wealth, source of funds, making sure that you've got your transaction monitoring set up, that you know the profile of where the repayments are coming from, where the proceeds are being used for, and then you've got evidence to back that up in terms of documentation that you're looking for. As well as kind of all of your standard UBO type controls on identifying and verifying directors, controllers, etc.
Just curious, have you been part of uncovering a lot of cases where you, let's say, just lending to someone or a business, and then they use that amount you lend out for something legitimate, but actually the repayment has come from some illicit activity? Is that hard to spot? Have you actually been able to find a lot of those cases, or is it very difficult?
It can be challenging, particularly if transactions are, and again, just for clarity, Clearbank doesn't lend, so but I have been in scenarios where there has been lending involved. I think it's particularly difficult when it's overseas, so when funds are coming in via international payments, and where that isn't kind of one part of the chain, so there's different legs to the transaction. That can make it harder to trace where the funds are coming from. So getting real clarity over that, and also challenging information where there is something, a discrepancy either in potentially the country the funds are originating from or the type of entity it's coming from, that doesn't quite stack up with that DD that you collected up front when you were going through the lending process. That's an important part of making sure that you challenge that just in the same way you would if it was a transaction over an operating account. And so that kind of DD process up front to really understand what it is that you're expecting, and then being able to look at what you're getting through and making sure those tie up, that's the really critical part. Those overseas transactions can be particularly challenging to make sure that you're tracing those funds back to, and that they match up with what you're expecting to come through.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We are coming to the end, but I mean, you are soon to be CEO of Clearbank UK, so I have to ask, what is it that you're looking the most forward to taking on that role? So
far, Clearbank's been a really great place to work. I really enjoy the innovation, being part of the kind of broader fintech community, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to build on the success we've had today. I think the opportunity is really big, and particularly when we look ahead to opportunities, say, in the digital asset space, and also kind of non-regulated, and how we might help serve those markets. I think that's really exciting. I'm also really looking forward to working closer with many of our clients because they're doing really exciting things in the market, and so helping them to continue building on their success.
And what is it that you're going to miss most working as closely with the compliance team as you are now? I guess you still will be working closely with compliance. That's a big part of banking, but, you know, not as closely as now.
I think you're always looking at things from a slightly different angle. So I really enjoyed that over the past period when I've been working in that space. So for example, when we're looking and we're working on kind of trends in the market from a financial crime perspective, when you're in the risk function, you get to get really close to the detail of, well, why did that work like that? And how was that structured? And how did you get to this? And I think I won't obviously be as close to that. And there's some really interesting things that go on in that space. And I have really enjoyed working very closely and building the team that we have at Clearbank, which I'm very proud of in the risk space. Obviously, I'll still be working with them, but they'll be just part of my broader team rather than directly my team.
Yes. And but before I leave you, we will have to dish out some quick fire questions regarding the topic of banking licenses. So are you ready? Mm-hmm. I'll just say a sentence and you'll say the first words that come to mind. All right. What 3 words would you use to describe the banking license application process?
Intense, challenging, and lengthy.
What's the one thing you definitely should have together before you apply?
I'd say real clarity over a business model that's viable.
Does the license make you more or less susceptible to being a target of financial crime and money laundering?
I think it's more about when you're newly authorized, it makes you more of a target for criminals, but not necessarily more susceptible.
Why do these licenses matter to customers?
I think although banking's taken quite a knock in the last decade or so, I think there's still a trust component that comes with a full banking license in terms of safety and stability and the highest standard of regulation.
And with that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Emma, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn and also via our website at clear.bank.
And thanks to everyone who was listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. Got a story that you think we should be talking about? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Your data problem and your workflow problem, now it isn't your problem. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Money makes a world go round.